Introduction to Monetary Reform, Part 1. In this lesson, you will learn what is monetary reform, when did it start, what are the fundamental principles to reform, and where are we now in the reform process. Before we begin, let's explain the workspace. The workspace consists of 5 sections. Each section has a purpose, and they all together work in unity. Here is an example of a workspace. Located across the top, similar to a toolbar, is the Guide to the Global Financial Crisis Timeline. The purpose is to assist in plotting a coordinate or monthly location, and that is done by identifying it in a shaded yellow box. The red square is the October 2008 credit shock and the 1929 October credit shock. The green square is the September 1931 currency shock and the potential September 2010 currency shock. Section 2 is color-coded coordinate numbers. Red refers to the Great Depression, yellow the global financial crisis, and blue monetary reform. The small print below the coordinate number refers to the pricing system, nominal versus real, actual versus estimated. Section 4 is designated for any pertinent information relative to the coordinate in analysis. And Section 5 is the title and the content area. For monetary reform, the yellow square is placed 1 month after the credit shock of October 2008. Monetary means money, both debt and currency. Reform means rehab, repair, improve, or replace. Monetary reform is a period when the world monetary system is under construction. The 4 major components to the world monetary system are credit, currency, banking, and gold. Monetary reform is the 5th phase of the world monetary cycle. The reform process started on November 15, 2008, when world leaders gathered in Washington, D.C. to address deterioration of world economic conditions from the credit crisis. Phase 1 gold standard of the current cycle began July 1944 with the signing of the Bretton Woods Agreement. 2 key points to make: the U.S. dollar became the world reserve currency and the International Monetary Fund was established. Phase 4 deflation began in July of 2007 with the subprime crisis. It's also referred to as the global financial crisis. All 4 major components of the world monetary system go into crisis in this phase: credit, currency, banking, and gold. Phase 5 monetary reform began on November 15th of 2008 when world leaders gathered in Washington, D.C. to discuss policy on how to respond to the worldwide economic collapse triggered by the October 2008 credit shock. This is the first shock of the global financial crisis. G20 agreed to broader policy response with closer macroeconomic cooperation to restore growth, avoid negative spillovers, and support emerging market economies in developing countries. They agreed to take immediate steps to achieve these objectives as well as to address longer-term challenges. They agreed to move to stabilize the financial system, apply monetary policy to support appropriate domestic conditions, support policy framework conducive to jurisdiction fiscal sustainability, help emerging and developing economies gain access to finance through the International Monetary Fund, assist World Bank and multilateral development banks in supporting their development agenda, and to ensure IMF, World Bank, and other MDBs have sufficient resources. In addition to these actions, the G20 committed to implementing policies consistent with 5 common principles for reform. So the G20 Summit number 1 was held in response to Phase 4 deflation, shock number 1 credit shock. The issues centered around unfreezing the global credit markets, reforming the Bretton Woods institutions, and expanding regulatory oversight. 5 common principles of monetary reform and organizations mandated by G20. Principle number 1, strengthening transparency and accountability. Principle number 2, enhancing sound regulation. Principle number 3, promoting integrity in financial markets. Principle number 4, reinforcing international cooperation. And principle number 5, reforming international financial institutions. Strengthening transparency and accountability. Strengthen financial market transparency, enhancing disclosure on financial products, ensuring complete and accurate disclosure by firms of their financial conditions. 2 organizations mandated by G8, Financial Action Task Force, the Global Forum on Tax Transparency and Exchange of Information, also referred to as the Global Forum. Enhancing sound regulation. Strengthen regulatory regimes, oversight, risk management of financial markets, products and participants, strong oversight over credit rating agencies, consistent with International Code of Conduct. Key organizations is the Financial Stability Board, the International Accounting Standard Board, the Financial Accounting Standard Board, and the Bank of International Settlements Basel Committee. Promoting integrity in financial markets, protecting against illicit finance risk arising from non-cooperative jurisdictions, promote information sharing, commit to international standards to bank secrecy and transparency. Key organization is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Enforcing international cooperation. National regional regulators to formulate regulations and other measures in consistent manner. Regulators set priority, strengthen cooperation, crisis prevention, management, and resolution. A key group in this area is the Financial Inclusion Expert Group. Reforming international financial institutions. Reform Bretton Woods institutions to reflect changing economic weights in world economy, emerging and developing economies having greater voice and representation, organizations of the IMF, World Bank, and the 4 sub-banks of the World Bank, the multilateral development banks. A quick overview of the monetary reform process. Summit number 1 was in Washington, D.C. on November 14th and 15th of 2008. Summit number 2 was in London, England, April 1st and 2nd, 2009. Summit number 3 was Pittsburgh, USA, September 24th through the 25th, 2009. Summit number 4, Toronto, Canada, June 25th, 26th, 2010. And Summit number 5, Seoul, Korea, November 11th through 12th, 2010. G20 Summit number 1 was in response to Phase 4 deflation, shock number 1, the credit shock. Will the G20 Summit number 5 policy be in response to Phase 4 deflation, shock number 2, the currency shock? To recap, from this lesson, you should have learned what is monetary reform, when did it start, what are the fundamental principles to reform, and where are we in the reform process? What we discovered is monetary reform is the world monetary system under construction. Phase 5 monetary reform started in November of 2008 after the first shock, the credit shock of Phase 4 deflation. We discovered there are 5 common principles of reform: strengthening transparency and accountability, enhancing sound regulation, promoting integrity in financial markets, reinforcing international cooperation, and reforming international financial institutions. We also learned that we are in the 4th summit of a 5-summit schedule, with the 5th summit to be held in Seoul, Korea. The road to monetary reform leads to Seoul, Korea, November 11th and 12th, 2010. Finance ministers and central bank governors announced on June 3rd, 2010 that they will be intensifying their efforts. An assessment process and timetable leading up to Seoul is now in place. Track monetary reform by becoming a subscriber today. Get G20 declarations and a communique plus commentary after each summit and minister and bank governor meeting. Join us as we continue our discussion on monetary reform, Part 2, as it is made available in the Solution Center Study Hall.